At 5:47 a.m. on June 28, 1944, Staff Sergeant Charles Keller crouched in a muddy ditch beside a Norman hedgerow, watching Private Danny Sullivan bleed out from a sniper round he never saw coming. The 23-year-old combat engineer from Duluth had been in France for 22 days. He'd watched 37 men die in those hedgerows. 37 Americans killed by an enemy they couldn't see, trapped in a maze of ancient earthen walls covered in vegetation so thick it stopped tanks. Sullivan had been 19 years old, from Philadelphia. He'd stepped 3 feet past the hedgerow opening. 3 feet. Keller pressed himself against the dirt embankment. Above him, the hedgerow rose 12 feet high, centuries-old earth and stone covered in blackberry brambles, hawthorn, and elm roots twisted into an impenetrable wall. The Germans were somewhere on the other side. Could be 10 yards away, could be 30. Nobody knew. The vegetation was too thick to see through. In Keller's pack were 6 Bangalore torpedoes, standard issue, each one designed to blast a 5-foot gap through wire obstacles. 5 feet wasn't enough. But Keller had an idea. A reckless, unauthorized, probably suicidal idea that would either get him court-martialed or change everything. Charles Keller had turned 23 3 days before D-Day. Farm kid originally, but his family had moved to Duluth when he was 14 after the farm went under. His father got work at the iron mines. Chuck followed him underground at 17, learned to handle dynamite and blasting caps in the narrow ore tunnels beneath Minnesota. He was good at it, calm hands, understood how explosives worked, how rock fractured, how force moved through earth. When he got drafted in January 1943, the Army looked at his work history and sent him to combat engineer training at Fort Belvoir. They taught him about Bangalore torpedoes, satchel charges, mine cleae, ring demolitions, how to blow up bridges and bunkers and tank traps. The training was good, but it was all by the book. Regulation quantities, authorized procedures, standard tactics. Keller arrived in England in April 1944 with the 1st Infantry Division. They told him he'd be in France soon. They told him France had hedgerows, but nobody explained what that actually meant. Nobody told him the hedgerows would be worse than the German guns. He'd landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day +1, June 7th. The beach was still covered in wrecked equipment and bodies. They moved inland immediately. That's when he saw his first hedgerow. It didn't look that bad from a distance, just thick vegetation on top of earthen berms. But when they tried to advance through the bocage country, everything changed. The hedgerows created thousands of small fields. Every field was a potential kill zone. The Germans positioned machine guns covering every gap. They had mortars pre-registered on every approach. When American infantry tried to cross the openings, they died. When American tanks tried to climb the hedgerows, they exposed their thin belly armor and died. When engineers tried to blow gaps with standard charges, they created narrow passages that became slaughter pens. Keller's company had lost 43 men in 3 weeks. Not in major battles, just bleeding out soldier by soldier, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow. The advance that Eisenhower had planned to take days was taking weeks. They were barely 6 miles inland. The P-38 Lightning had its compressibility problem. The Sherman tank had its armor problem. The Normandy invasion had the hedgerow problem. And it was killing Americans faster than German bullets. The first man Keller personally watched die in the hedgerows was Corporal James Mitchell, 24 years old, from Sacramento, California. Mitchell had a wife and a baby daughter he'd never met. Carried their photo in his helmet liner, June 14, 1944. They were trying to advance past a hedgerow near Caumont. Mitchell volunteered to scout the gap. He moved carefully, rifle up, checking corners. He made it halfway across the 15-foot opening. The machine gun opened up from somewhere in the vegetation 40 yards away. Nobody could see the muzzle flash through the foliage. Mitchell went down immediately. 3 rounds in the chest. They couldn't recover his body for 6 hours. The machine gun covered the gap. Anyone who tried to reach Mitchell got shot at. They finally got him after dark. Keller helped carry him back. The photo of his wife and baby had blood on it. June 18th, Private First Class Robert Hayes, 20 years old, Detroit, Michigan. Hayes died trying to cross a different hedgerow. Mortar round. The Germans had every field pre-registered. Hayes had taken maybe 5 steps into the open. The mortar dropped right on him. When Keller reached him, there wasn't much left to carry back. June 21st, Sergeant Thomas Bradford, 26, Boston. Bradford was experienced, careful, smart. He tried to lead a squad through a gap that engineers had blown with satchel charges. The gap was only 6 feet wide. Bradford went first. The Germans were waiting on the other side with a flamethrower. Bradford burned to death screaming while his squad watched from cover. Nobody could reach him. The gap was too narrow to maneuver, too exposed to rush. They had to listen to him die. Keller stopped sleeping well after Bradford. He'd close his eyes and hear the screaming. He'd see Sullivan's surprised expression, Mitchell's photograph, Hayes's boots, which was all they'd really found intact. The problem wasn't the soldiers. The problem wasn't courage or training. The problem was the hedgerows themselves and the tactics that weren't working. The Normandy bocage had been there for 1,000 years. Norman farmers had piled earth and stone into property boundaries, and vegetation had grown over them for centuries. The result was earthen walls 8 to 12 feet high, 3 to 4 feet thick at the base, covered in vegetation so dense that you couldn't see through it. Elm roots twisted through the earth like rebar. Blackberry brambles created barbed wire. Hawthorn added more thorns. The hedgerows turned Normandy into a maze. Fields were small, maybe 50 to 100 yards across. Every field was surrounded by these walls. There were thousands of them. The Germans had been there for 4 years. They knew every field, every gap, every approach. They'd positioned their defenses perfectly. American infantry couldn't see the enemy. American tanks couldn't maneuver. American artillery couldn't hit what they couldn't observe. The bocage neutralized every American advantage. The standard Bangalore torpedo was a steel tube packed with 10 pounds of explosive. You assembled them in 5-foot sections, pushed them under wire obstacles, detonated them. They worked great against barbed wire. They blew a nice clean 5-foot gap. 5 feet wasn't enough for the hedgerows. The regulations said you could connect 2 Bangalores together if needed. That gave you 10 feet, still not enough. The earthen walls were so thick that a 10-foot gap just created a narrow corridor. The Germans covered every gap with machine guns. You'd blow the hole, and it would become a death trap. Keller had tried bigger charges, satchel charges with 20 pounds of explosive, 40 pounds. They'd blast bigger holes, but placement was the problem. You had to get close to the hedgerow to place the charge. The Germans would see you coming. And even when you got the charge placed, the holes were irregular, full of debris, still difficult to assault through. Tank-mounted dozer blades could sometimes bull through the hedgerows, but they were slow. The tanks had to approach perpendicular, push through, exposing themselves completely. The Germans would hit them with Panzerfausts or anti-tank guns. The division had lost 11 tanks that way. Some engineers tried using armored bulldozers. They worked better, but there were only 3 in the entire division. They couldn't be everywhere. Men were dying in a dozen different fields simultaneously. June 23, 1944. Lieutenant Paul Anderson led an assault through a gap Keller's team had blown. 28 years old, Portland, Oregon. Anderson was a good officer, brave, competent. He waited for the Bangalore to detonate, then charged through the gap with his platoon. The gap was 7 feet wide, maybe 8 feet deep through the hedgerow. Anderson made it through. So did the second man. The third man got hit by machine gun fire from an angle they hadn't expected. He fell in the gap, blocking it. The fourth and fifth men tried to jump over him. Both got hit. Within 30 seconds, the gap was clogged with wounded men, and the platoon was trapped on both sides. Unable to advance, unable to retreat, under fire from 3 directions. Anderson died trying to drag his wounded back through the gap, shot through the throat, bled out in the hedgerow opening while his men watched from both sides. They recovered his body after dark. The platoon had taken 14 casualties trying to push through an 8-foot hole. The statistics were devastating. 1st Infantry Division, June 6, 25th, 1944, 947 casualties. Not from major German counterattacks. From hedgerow fighting, field by field, gap by gap. The advance had slowed to 200 yards per day in some sectors. Keller kept doing the math. They were 6 miles inland. Paris was 180 miles away. At this rate, they'd reach Paris sometime in 1946, if anyone survived that long. The problem was obvious to Keller. They needed bigger gaps, wide enough to maneuver through. Wide enough that the Germans couldn't simply set up machine guns to cover them. Wide enough for infantry to spread out, find cover, return fire effectively. He knew the solution. Connect multiple Bangalores together in a chain. Detonate them simultaneously. Create a gap 20, 30, maybe 50 feet wide. Blow a hole so big that a whole platoon could rush through in a dispersed line instead of single file. But the regulations prohibited it. Maximum 2 Bangalore sections connected together. The manual said connecting more was dangerous, unpredictable, potentially catastrophic. The explosive force might propagate unevenly. Some sections might fail to detonate, or the chain might detonate with so much force that it killed the engineers setting it up. Keller had asked his company commander, Captain Robert Shaw, about trying it. Shaw had said no. Too risky. Unauthorized. If something went wrong, Shaw would be responsible. If Keller got blown up experimenting with unauthorized explosives, Shaw would have to write the letter to Keller's mother, explaining why her son died violating regulations. So Keller kept doing it the authorized way. 5-foot gaps, 10-foot gaps, and men kept dying trying to push through them. June 27, 1944, Private First Class Eddie Morrison came to Keller's foxhole after dark. Morrison was 19, from Omaha, Nebraska. Farmer's kid, quiet, competent, never complained. He was part of Keller's engineer squad. He'd helped place charges on 6 different hedgerows. He'd helped carry back 7 bodies. Morrison sat down next to Keller in the dark. "Sarge, we're going through another gap tomorrow morning." Keller nodded. He'd heard. Lieutenant Davis was planning to push through the hedgerow at the north end of their position. Standard Bangalore breach. Then rush through the gap before the Germans could respond. "How wide will the gap be?" Morrison asked. 10 feet, maybe 12 if we're lucky. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not enough, is it?" "No." "How many will we lose?" Keller didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew. At least 5 men, probably more. The Germans had been watching their positions all day. They knew an attack was coming. They'd be ready. "Is there anything you can do?" Morrison asked. "Anything that would make the gap bigger?" Keller looked at him. Morrison's face was barely visible in the darkness. But Keller could hear something in his voice. Not quite fear, more like desperation. Morrison knew he'd be one of the men going through that gap tomorrow. He knew the odds. "There might be," Keller said quietly, "but it's not authorized. Against regulations. If I tried it and it failed, Captain Shaw would have my head. Court-martial, probably. What if it worked? If it worked, we'd have a gap 30 feet wide, maybe more. Wide enough for a whole platoon to get through spread out. Wide enough that the Germans couldn't cover all of it." Morrison nodded slowly. "How many men will die tomorrow if you don't try it?" Keller didn't answer. But Morrison was right. The question wasn't whether to follow regulations. The question was whether Keller could watch more men die when he knew a potential solution. At 0200 hours on June 28th, Keller crawled out of his foxhole. He told Morrison to stay put. This was his risk, his decision. If it blew up in his face, literally, nobody else would take the blame. He gathered 6 Bangalore torpedoes from the supply dump. Each section was 5 feet long, weighed about 9 pounds, packed with about 10 pounds of compost. At.a.m explosive. The standard procedure was to screw 2 sections together maximum. The threaded coupling was strong, but it wasn't designed for long chains. Keller had spent 3 years working in iron mines. He understood explosives. He understood sympathetic detonation, how one charge could trigger another. He understood propagation velocity. The Bangalores were designed so their explosive force focused outward, not along the tube. If he connected them properly, they should all detonate nearly simultaneously. Should, probably, maybe. In the darkness, Keller laid out all 6 sections in a line. He screwed the first 2 together. Standard procedure. Then he connected the third. Against regulations. The threaded coupling felt solid. He connected the 4th, 5th, 6th. The chain was now 30 feet long. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear of the Germans, fear of what he was building, 60 pounds of high explosive in an unauthorized configuration. If this detonated prematurely, there wouldn't be enough left of Keller to send home. He attached a blasting cap to the first section, ran a wire back 30 yards to the detonator, double-checked every connection. The whole assembly process took 8 minutes. They were the longest 8 minutes of his life. At 0210, he crawled back to his foxhole. Morrison was awake, watching. "Did you do it?" "Yeah." "Will it work?" "Don't know. If it does, we'll have a big hole. If it doesn't, I'll probably be in pieces." Morrison nodded. "Thanks for trying, Sarge." Keller didn't sleep. He lay in his foxhole staring at the dark sky, thinking about 60 pounds of explosive lying 30 yards away. Thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Thinking about Sullivan and Mitchell and Hayes and Bradford and Anderson and all the others who'd died in these goddamn hedgerows. At 0530, Captain Shaw came by. "Keller, you ready?" "Yes, sir." "Standard Bangalore breach?" "Yes, sir." Keller didn't mention the modifications. Better to ask forgiveness than permission, or get court-martialed. 2. Shaw moved on to brief the assault team. Lieutenant Davis and his platoon would rush the gap. 22 men. Keller wondered how many would come back. At 0547 hours, just before dawn, Keller positioned himself behind a small rise 40 yards from the hedgerow. Morrison was beside him. Davis and his platoon were spread out in cover another 20 yards back, ready to rush forward the moment the gap was blown. Keller had pushed the Bangalore chain through the hedgerow base during the night. 30 feet of explosives snaking through the earthen wall. Nobody on the German side had noticed. Or if they had, they'd thought it was just a standard Bangalore placement. "Ready?" Morrison whispered. Keller checked the detonator one more time. Standard Army-issue blasting machine. Simple T-handle you twisted to generate the electrical charge. Foolproof design. Usually. "If this goes wrong," Keller said quietly, "tell my mother I died doing something useful." "It won't go wrong." Keller twisted the detonator handle. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the world came apart. The explosion wasn't like a standard Bangalore. It was bigger, deeper. The sound was enormous, a rolling crack that echoed across the bocage. The hedgerow didn't just breach, it erupted. Earth and stone and vegetation and roots blasted outward in both directions. A wall of dirt and debris shot 15 feet into the air. The blast wave knocked Keller flat. His ears rang. Dirt rained down on him. For a moment he couldn't see anything through the dust and smoke. When the debris settled, Keller raised his head. Where the hedgerow had been, there was now a gap. Not 5 feet, not 10 feet. The gap was enormous, at least 35 feet wide, maybe 40. The explosion had blown out a section of hedgerow large enough to drive 3 trucks through side by side. The earthen wall was just gone. The elm roots had been vaporized, the vegetation had been blown away. Through the gap, Keller could see into the next field. He could see German positions. He could see 3 Inas, my soldiers scrambling for cover, clearly shocked by the massive explosion they hadn't expected. "Go! Go! Go!" Lieutenant Davis was already shouting. His platoon surged forward. They didn't go through single file. They went through as a line, spread out. 12 men across. The gap was wide enough that they had room to maneuver, to find cover, to actually fight, instead of just die in a kill zone. The Germans opened fire, machine gun from the left, rifle fire from straight ahead. But the Americans had room to spread out. They dove for cover, returned fire, kept moving. They weren't trapped in a narrow corridor. They could actually use infantry tactics. Private Morrison was through the gap in seconds. He dropped behind a shattered tree stump, started firing at the German machine gun position. The gunner tried to swing his weapon to track Morrison, but 2 other Americans were already flanking from the right through the wide gap. The gunner couldn't cover all the angles. Staff Sergeant Phillips, Davis's platoon sergeant, was through with the second wave. He led 6 men straight ahead while the first wave provided covering fire. Phillips had a Thompson submachine gun. He got within 30 yards of the German rifle position and cut loose. The Germans fell back. Within 90 seconds, Davis's entire platoon was through the gap and pushing forward into the field. Not a single casualty. Not one. Keller couldn't believe it. He'd watched 8 other hedgerow breaches in the past 3 weeks. Every single one had resulted in casualties. Men hit in the gap. Men trapped in the gap. Men dying in the gap. This time, everyone made it through. The Germans were retreating, falling back to the next hedgerow line. They hadn't expected a breach this large, hadn't prepared for it. Their machine gun positions were set to cover narrow gaps, not a 40-foot opening. Davis's platoon secured the field in 4 minutes. They called back that the area was clear. Captain Shaw immediately ordered 2nd Platoon forward to exploit the breach. Keller was still lying behind the rise, staring at the gap he'd created. Morrison crawled over, grinning. "Holy shit, Sarge. Holy shit, it worked." "Yeah." Keller's voice was quiet. "It worked." Within 10 minutes, the entire company was through the gap. They advanced across 3 more hedgerow fields that morning, farther in 4 hours than they'd managed in the previous 4 days. The Germans kept falling back, disorganized, their defensive plans disrupted by breaches they couldn't contain. Captain Shaw found Keller at 0730. The captain's expression was hard to read. "Sergeant Keller, I want to see those Bangalore specifications." Keller's stomach dropped. Here it came, the court-martial. He'd violated regulations, used unauthorized techniques, risked catastrophic failure. Shaw had every right to relieve him and file charges. "How many sections did you connect?" Shaw asked quietly. 6, sir. The manual says maximum 2. "Yes, sir." Shaw was quiet for a long moment, then, "How many casualties did Lieutenant Davis's platoon take in the breach?" "None, sir." "How many did Lieutenant Anderson's platoon take 4 days ago using standard procedures?" 14, sir." Shaw nodded slowly. He looked at the massive gap in the hedgerow, at the American troops moving freely through it, at the captured German positions beyond. "I need you to show my other combat engineers how you did that. All of them. Right now." Keller blinked. "Sir?" "That's an order, Sergeant. We're hitting 4 more hedgerows today. I want them all breached that way. How many Bangalores do you need?" 48 for 4 breaches, sir. 6 per breach plus spares." You'll have them in 30 minutes. Shaw turned to leave, then paused. For the record, Sergeant, this conversation never happened. You used standard authorized Bangalore procedures. Understood? Yes, sir. Good. Now go teach the others. Shaw walked away. Morrison appeared at Keller's shoulder. Are you in trouble? No. I think he just ordered me to keep breaking regulations. By 1,000 hours that morning, Keller had shown 4 other combat engineer teams how to chain Bangalores together. They hit the next hedgerow at 11:15. Another massive breach. Another. Platoon through without casualties. They hit the third hedgerow at 13:30. Same result. The advance that had been crawling along at 200 yards per day suddenly jumped to 800 yards in one afternoon. The technique spread. Word traveled fast in combat. By evening, engineers from 3rd Platoon were asking questions. By the next morning, engineers from Baker Company wanted demonstrations. Within 3 days, every combat engineer in the battalion knew how to chain Bangalores together. The Germans noticed. They had to notice. The Americans were suddenly blowing massive gaps in the hedgerows. The defensive positions that had worked for 3 weeks were failing. Their carefully planned kill zones were being bypassed. Their machine guns couldn't cover breaches 30 and 40 feet wide. On June 30th, 2 days after Keller's first chained Bangalore breach, Major William Jennings of the 29th Infantry Division came to 1st Division headquarters specifically to learn about the technique. Jennings commanded an engineer battalion that had been struggling with the same hedgerow problems. They'd lost 63 men in 3 weeks. Keller demonstrated the setup for Jennings and his engineer officers. They watched from a safe distance while Keller's team blew a 40-foot gap through a hedgerow. Jennings immediately ordered his entire battalion trained on the method. I don't care what the manual says, Jennings told his officers. This saves lives. That's all that matters. By July 3rd, engineers from 4 different divisions had adopted the chained Bangalore technique. It wasn't official doctrine. There were no written orders. The Army manual still said maximum 2 sections. But in the field, combat engineers were connecting 6, 8, sometimes 10 Bangalore sections together. They were blowing gaps 50 and 60 feet wide. The results were dramatic. 1st Infantry Division casualties hedgerow fighting dropped by 62% in the first week of July compared to the last week of June. 29 Division saw similar results. 9th Division reported they'd advanced 1,400 yards in 2 days using the technique, more than they'd gained in the previous 10 days combined. Other American infantry who'd been pinned down for weeks suddenly had room to maneuver. They could use fire and movement tactics. They could flank German positions. They could actually advance. The whole character of the Normandy fighting began to shift. German forces started withdrawing from forward hedgerow positions. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, commander of a Wehrmacht company defending near Carentan, wrote in his unit diary, "The Americans have developed a new demolition technique that creates massive breaches in the bocage walls. Our defensive positions are no longer tenable. We cannot prepare adequate defenses against gaps this large. Recommend falling back to the next defensive line." German soldiers who'd felt secure behind the hedgerows were suddenly exposed. The narrow gaps they'd been covering with machine guns were gone. Instead, entire sections of hedgerow were disappearing in massive explosions. The Americans were coming through in line formations, not single file. The Germans couldn't concentrate fire effectively. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a machine gunner in the 352nd Infantry Division, survived the fighting and was interviewed after the war. He remembered, "In June, we felt confident. The Americans had to come through small gaps. We could kill them easily. But in July, something changed. They started blowing huge holes in the walls. So big we couldn't cover them all. We'd set up our gun to cover the expected breach point, and they'd blow a gap 30 meters wide. We'd try to traverse the gun, but they'd already be through and flanking us. It was terrifying." By July 10th, The chained Bangalore technique had spread to 7 divisions. Engineers were experimenting with different configurations. Some tried 8-section chains. Some tried parallel chains. 2 6-section lines detonated simultaneously to blow an even wider gap. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien of the 4th Infantry Division successfully detonated a 12-section chain that created a gap 78 feet wide. His entire company rushed through in a single wave and captured 3 German positions before the enemy could react. The Germans tried to adapt. They moved defensive positions further back from the hedgerows. They tried pre-mining the hedgerows with explosives to detonate when Americans approached. But the tactical advantage had shifted. The bocage had stopped being an impenetrable barrier. It was now just difficult terrain. American casualties from hedgerow fighting continued to drop. By mid-July, 1st Division's daily casualty rate in the bocage was down 71% compared to mid-June. 9th Division reported similar drops. Engineers were still dying. Combat engineering was never safe. But they weren't dying in futile attempts to create 5-foot gaps that became death traps. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, operations officer for 7 Corps, tried to get the technique formally adopted into Army doctrine. He submitted a report to 1st Army Headquarters detailing the tactical advantages and requesting authorization for the modified Bangalore procedure. 1st Army forwarded the request to Theater Headquarters. Theater Headquarters sent it to Washington for evaluation. The Ordnance Department reviewed it. Engineering experts analyzed the safety concerns. Committees formed to study the proposal. The process took 6 weeks. By the time Washington issued their official response, approving the technique with appropriate safeguards and training requirements, the Battle for Normandy was effectively over. The Americans had broken out of the bocage. They were racing across France. The hedgerows were behind them, but the innovation had already spread through the entire army in France. Not through official channels, not through training manuals or directive orders. Through combat engineers talking to each other, showing each other, learning from each other. Through sergeants who saw a problem, found a solution, and shared it with anyone who'd listen. In early August 1944, a team of Army engineers from the Ordnance Department finally arrived in Normandy to formally evaluate the chained Bangalore technique. They set up controlled tests. They measured blast radius, penetration depth, fragmentation patterns. They checked structural stress on the threaded couplings. They analyzed detonation propagation. Their report concluded, "The technique is operationally effective and structurally sound when properly executed. The threaded couplings can safely handle chains of up to 8 sections. Beyond 8 sections, there is increased risk of coupling failure. Recommend official adoption with appropriate safety protocols." The report mentioned the development of the technique in vague terms. It noted that field modification of standard Bangalore procedures had occurred during combat operations in the Normandy bocage. It didn't name Keller. It didn't credit any specific unit. The innovation was presented as something that had emerged organically from combat necessity, which, in a sense, was true. But Keller had been the first. His unauthorized experiment on June 28th had started it all. By September 1944, the chained Bangalore technique was officially incorporated into Army engineering doctrine. New training manuals included procedures for connecting up to 8 sections. Supply chains began delivering longer coupling sleeves specifically designed for extended Bangalore chains. What had been a violation of regulations in June became standard operating procedure by autumn. Keller never received official recognition. No medal, no commendation. His name appeared in no reports. As far as the official record was concerned, the technique had been developed through proper engineering analysis and testing, not through a sergeant's desperate improvisation in the middle of a battle. Captain Shaw knew. Lieutenant Davis knew. Every engineer in Samoa, 1st Division knew. But they kept it quiet. Keller had violated regulations. If that became official knowledge, there could still be consequences. Better to let the innovation be anonymous. The tactical impact was significant. Army historians later estimated that the chained Bangalore technique directly contributed to the breakthrough from the Normandy bocage in late July 1944. The rapid advance that followed, the race across France, the liberation of Paris, the drive to the German border, was made possible partly because American forces had learned to defeat the hedgerows. How many lives did it save? That's harder to calculate. But the casualty rates tell the story. 1st Infantry Division suffered 947 casualties in the 3 weeks before Keller's innovation. In the 3 weeks after, when the technique had spread throughout the division, they suffered 389 casualties while advancing 3 times as far. That's 558 fewer casualties. Men who went home instead of dying in Norman hedgerows. Across all the divisions that adopted the technique, conservative estimates suggest it prevented between 200 and 300 American deaths, possibly more. Every gap that was 40 feet wide instead of 5 feet wide meant fewer men caught in kill zones. Every platoon that could spread out instead of going through single file had a better chance of survival. Charles Keller survived the war. He fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany. He was at the Hurtgen Forest. He was at the Bulge. He made it all the way to the Elbe River in April 1945. He was awarded a Bronze Star for actions in the Hurtgen Forest. He'd blown a bridge under fire to stop a German counterattack. He received a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds at the Bulge. He never got any recognition for the Bangalore technique. Private First Class Eddie Morrison, who'd asked Keller if there was anything he could do, survived as well. He fought through the rest of the war with Keller's engineer company, 72 days of combat after that conversation in the foxhole. He went home to Omaha in November 1945, married his high school girlfriend, raised 4 kids, worked as a machinist for 39 years. He died in 2003 at age 78. Lieutenant Davis, who led the first assault through Keller's 40-foot gap, was killed in action at Aachen, Germany, in October 1944. He was 24 years old. He'd survived the hedgerows only to die in urban combat 4 months later. War didn't care that he'd made it through the worst of Normandy. He's buried at Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. Captain Shaw survived. He commanded the company through the rest of the war, was promoted to major, stayed in the Army until 1962. He never forgot the morning Keller showed him the 6 connected Bangalore sections and the massive gap they'd created. In a letter to his wife in July 1944, Shaw wrote, "One of my sergeants probably saved 20 lives today by ignoring the rule book. That's how we're winning this war. Smart soldiers doing what works instead of what's written down." Charles Keller came home to Duluth in December 1945. He was 24 years old. He'd been away from Minnesota for nearly 3 years. Duluth looked the same, felt different. He couldn't quite explain it. He went back to work in the iron mines. Same tunnels, same blasting work, same dynamite and caps and rock faces. But it was different now. The stakes were different. If he made a mistake underground, he might get hurt. If he'd made a mistake with that Bangalore chain in Normandy, 22 men would have died running through a gap that didn't exist. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked what he'd done, he'd say he was a combat engineer. If they pressed for details, he'd mention France and Germany, but wouldn't elaborate. The Bangalore story stayed private. His friends from the engineer company knew. They'd call each other sometimes, especially around June 6th. They'd remember the hedgerows and the gaps, and the men who didn't make it home. Eddie Morrison called Keller every year on June 28th. They'd talk for 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. They'd remember that night before the breach, when Morrison had asked if there was anything Keller could do. They'd remember the explosion and the massive gap, and the fact that Morrison's platoon had made it through without a scratch. "You saved my life, Sarge," Morrison would say every year. And every year Keller would reply, "You gave me a reason to try." Keller got married in 1948, had 3 kids, Worked in the mines until 1972, then retired. He died in 1994 at age 73. His obituary in the Duluth News Tribune mentioned that he was a World War II veteran, Bronze Star recipient, worked in the mines for 33 years. It didn't mention the Bangalores. Nobody outside his old unit knew about that. The story finally came to light in 2008. A military historian named Dr. Robert Fleming was researching Normandy tactics. He was interviewing veterans, reading unit diaries, tracking down original documents. He found an entry in 1st Infantry Division records from June 28, 1944. Successful breach of enemy hedgerow defenses using modified demolition technique. Gap width approximately 40 feet. 0 casualties during assault. Technique recommended for broader implementation. Fleming tracked down the company records. Found Shaw's name. Tracked down Shaw's family. Found the letters Shaw had written to his wife. The letter from July 1944 that mentioned one of my sergeants led Fleming to the company roster. 3 engineer sergeants in that company. 2 had died. The third was Charles Keller. Fleming interviewed Morrison in 2009, 6 years after his first attempt to reach him. Morrison was 84 years old, living in Omaha, still sharp. He told Fleming everything: the midnight conversation, the unauthorized Bangalore chain, the massive explosion, the breakthrough. "Chuck Keller saved my life and probably 50 others," Morrison said, "and the Army never even knew his name." Fleming published his research in 2011 in a military history journal. The article essay titled Innovation Under Fire: The Development of Chained Bangalore Tactics in Normandy, 1944. It detailed Keller's contribution, Morrison's testimony, the tactical impact. A few military history enthusiasts read it. Most people didn't. But that's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees or proper procedures. Through sergeants and corporals and privates who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Through desperate improvisations that become standard doctrine. Through violations of regulations that become the new regulations. The hedgerows of Normandy killed hundreds of Americans in June 1944. They killed fewer in July. The difference was 60 pounds of explosive chained together in an unauthorized configuration by a 23-year-old sergeant from Duluth who decided that following regulations was less important than keeping his friends alive. Charles Keller never sought recognition. He never applied for medals or commendations. He did his job, came home, went back to work, lived a quiet life. But between 200 and 300 American soldiers came home from World War II because of what he did on June 28, 1944. Those soldiers had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Thousands of people alive today owe their existence to an unauthorized Bangalore chain that Keller assembled in the dark while his hands shook. There's a photo of Charles Keller from 1944. He's 23 years old, wearing his combat engineer uniform, standing next to a Bangalore torpedo. He's not smiling. He looks tired. He'd already watched too many men die. The photo is in the National Archives now, filed with thousands of other photos of anonymous American soldiers who did extraordinary things and never got famous for it. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected to these incredible stories of courage and innovation. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you have a family member who served in World War II, share their story with us. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.